Welcome, travelers, to Terrors in the Wild, where the line between myth and reality blurs in the darkest corners of the earth. Here, we unravel the most terrifying cryptids, dive deep into chilling horror stories, and explore the mysteries that haunt the wilderness. From shape-shifting monsters to forgotten legends, we uncover the creatures and tales that lurk just beyond the reach of human understanding. So, keep your wits sharp, hit that subscribe button, and prepare for a journey into the unknown. The wild is waiting, but beware. It's not just the animals you should fear.
Blood-red roses. The cold February air bit at Olivia Carter's cheeks as she stepped out of her office building. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, dusting the city streets in a soft white glow. Valentine's Day had arrived, and everywhere she looked, couples walked hand in hand. Restaurants glowed with candlelight, and street vendors sold roses wrapped in bright red paper. Olivia, however, had no plans for romance. She wasn't bitter about it, just busy. As a journalist for the Helena Tribune, she spent more time chasing leads than chasing love. Still, when she got home and found a small black box sitting on her doorstep, her stomach did an odd little flip. A Valentine's Day gift. She glanced around, but the street was empty. Kneeling, she picked up the box. It was tied with a black satin ribbon. There was no note, no name. Curious, she took it inside, set it on the kitchen counter, and hesitated before opening it. Inside, resting on a bed of deep red rose petals, was a single item, a dried, withered heart. Olivia recoiled, nearly dropping the box. The heart, small, shriveled, looked real. Her first thought was that this was some kind of sick joke, a prank from a friend, or maybe a disgruntled reader who didn't like one of her articles. But something about it felt wrong. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Do you like your gift, Olivia?" Her pulse quickened. "Who is this?" she typed back. 3 dots appeared. Then another message. "Roses are red, violets are blue. I've been watching, and I'm coming for you." Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't a joke. The next morning, Olivia woke to a gray, overcast sky and the lingering unease of the previous night. She had barely slept, jumping at every creak of her apartment and checking her phone every hour. The last text from the unknown number. "Roses are red, violets are blue. I've been watching, and I'm coming for you," played over and over in her mind. Shaking off her exhaustion, she dressed quickly and left for the police station. The Helena police station was a small brick building, unremarkable except for the rows of squad cars parked outside. Inside, the air smelled of stale coffee and paper. The officer at the front desk, a heavy-set man with tired eyes, barely looked up when she approached. "I need to report something," Olivia said, setting the black box on the counter. She had wrapped the heart in a plastic bag, the dried organ rattling slightly as she placed it down. The officer raised an eyebrow. "What is that?" "A heart," she said, her voice tight. "I think it's real." That got his attention. Within minutes, she was seated across from Detective Harris, a man in his mid-40s with sharp, calculating eyes and graying hair. He leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. "So, someone left this on your doorstep," Harris said, tapping his pen against his notepad. "No note? No return address?" "Nothing," Olivia confirmed. "Then I got a text from an unknown number." She handed him her phone, where the eerie message still sat on the screen. Harris frowned. "And you have no idea who could be sending this?" "No." "No ex-boyfriends? No stalkers?" She hesitated. "I had a bad breakup a couple of years ago, but this doesn't feel like him." Harris nodded slowly. then flipped open a folder and scribbled something down. "We'll run the number, see if we can trace it. As for the heart, we'll have it examined." Olivia exhaled, relief flooding her. "Thank you." Harris stood. "In the meantime, keep your doors locked, and if anything else happens, call me immediately." She left the station feeling slightly better. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe she was overreacting. Then she saw the roses. At first, Olivia thought she was imagining things. A trail of red rose petals stretched from the sidewalk up the front steps of her apartment building, leading straight to her door. They stood out starkly against the gray concrete, vibrant and fresh, as if they had just been placed there. Her stomach twisted. Slowly she climbed the steps, her breath quickening. The closer she got, the worse the feeling in her gut became. At her door, a bouquet of roses sat propped against the threshold. The petals were deep crimson, but as she looked closer, she noticed something disturbing. The edges of the flowers were slightly browned, as if they had been dipped in something dry. Blood? Her phone buzzed. Knock, knock. She sucked in a sharp breath, whipping her head around. The street was empty. No one stood in the hall behind her. No one lingered in the shadows. With trembling hands, she grabbed the bouquet and shoved open her door. She stepped inside, slammed it shut, and locked it. Leaning against the door, she stared at the flowers. A small card was nestled between the stems. With growing dread, she plucked it out. The message was written in elegant cursive. "Be mine." Her hand shook as she set the flowers down. Her mind raced. Who was doing this? Was it someone she knew? Someone watching her? She grabbed her phone and called Detective Harris. "I just got another message," she blurted as soon as he picked up. "And a bouquet of roses." There was a note. "Slow down," Harris said. "Where are you now?" "I just got home." "Is your door locked?" "Yes." "I'll send someone to drive by your place, but Olivia, this could still be a prank." She closed her eyes. "What if it's not?" Harris sighed. "Then we'll find out who it is. Just keep your phone close. If anything else happens, call me." The call ended. Olivia stared at her phone, unease twisting in her gut. She had the horrible feeling that whoever was behind this wasn't done yet. That night, Olivia sat curled on her couch, wrapped in a blanket, every light in her apartment turned on. The bouquet of roses sat on the kitchen counter, untouched, the bloodied edges of the petals haunting her. She had locked every door, checked every window, and yet the feeling of being watched clung to her like a second skin. The logical part of her brain told her she was overreacting, that the police were probably right. This was just a prank, maybe some cruel joke from a reader she had angered, or an ex with a twisted sense of humor, but the logical part of her brain couldn't explain the way the hair on the back of her neck stood on end, or the shadow she had seen earlier, moving just beyond her apartment building. She hadn't told Detective Harris about that. Maybe she should have. The clock on the wall read 1:42 a.m. when her phone buzzed again. "I see you." A shiver crawled down her spine. Slowly she turned her head toward the window. Outside, standing beneath the dim yellow glow of the streetlight, was a figure. Tall, motionless, watching. Her breath caught in her throat. The man wore a suit, black as the night around him. But it was his face that sent ice through her veins, or rather, the lack of it. His face was hidden behind a mask, porcelain white, emotionless, with hollow black eyes and a wide, painted smile. A grotesque parody of something human. A cold, creeping horror slithered into Olivia's chest. He wasn't moving, just standing there, head slightly tilted, as if he knew she was looking. Her phone buzzed again. "You look beautiful tonight." A scream built in her throat. Her hand shook as she grabbed the phone and dialed 911. The operator picked up immediately. 911, what's your emergency? "There's someone outside my apartment," Olivia whispered, barely able to get the words out. "He's watching me. He sent me messages." "What's your address?" She rattled it off, eyes never leaving the man in the mask. He still hadn't moved. "We have officers on the way," the operator assured her. "Stay on the line with me." Olivia swallowed hard. He's just standing there, wearing a mask. "Can you describe the mask?" White, no expression. Black eye holes. A smile. The operator was silent for a beat, as if processing the disturbing image. Then, movement. The man tilted his head a little further, and then without warning, he raised his hand and waved. A slow, deliberate motion. Her breath hitched. Then he stepped backward, melting into the darkness. Gone. Olivia pressed herself against the couch, phone clutched to her ear. "Ma'am?" the operator said. "Are they still there?" "No," she choked out. "He just disappeared." "We have officers arriving in 3 minutes. Stay inside." Her hands were ice cold as she clutched the blanket around her. 3 minutes. And she was alone. The police arrived shortly after, sirens cutting through the silent street. 2 officers knocked on her door, one of them Detective Harris. She let them in, her hands still trembling. They searched the area, found nothing. No footprints in the snow, no sign that anyone had even been standing there. The messages on her phone were real, but the masked man? Harris studied her carefully. "Are you sure you weren't dreaming?" Olivia's eyes flashed. "I know what I saw." Harris sighed, rubbing his forehead. "All right. We'll pull security footage from the area. In the meantime, I'd recommend staying somewhere else for a few nights." She shook her head. "I won't let whoever this is chase me out of my own home." Harris didn't argue. He just handed her his card. "If he comes back, you call me immediately." She nodded. But deep down she already knew this wasn't over. The police left after searching the area and finding nothing. No footprints in the snow. No sign of forced entry. No physical proof that the masked man had ever been there. But Olivia knew what she had seen. She locked the door the second they were gone, bolting it shut and double-checking the chain. Her fingers trembled as she pulled the blinds closed, making sure no sliver of the outside world could peek through. The apartment was suffocatingly silent. Too silent. She sat back on the couch, gripping her phone, her knees pulled up to her chest. The detective had suggested she stay with a friend, but who would she even call? Her closest friends lived out of state. Her coworkers at the newspaper barely knew her beyond polite conversations. She had never felt more alone. The glow of the television cast flickering light across the room. A horror movie played, some old slasher film she had put on for background noise, but she wasn't paying attention. Her mind was spinning. Who was he? A stalker? Someone she had wronged? Why was he watching her? And more importantly, how had he disappeared so fast? A shiver ran down her spine. She closed her eyes and took a shaky breath. Maybe Harris was right. Maybe she should get out of here for a while. Her phone buzzed. She jumped, heart slamming against her ribs. Hesitating, she looked down. A new message. "Did you like your flowers?" A lump formed in her throat. Her fingers hovered over the screen. Then another text came through. "I picked them just for you." Her stomach twisted. Her pulse pounded in her ears. With trembling hands, she typed a response. "Who are you? What do you want?" The reply was instant. "To love you." Olivia's breath hitched. She felt sick. A cold dread curled in her chest, squeezing her lungs. Her fingers shook as she typed another message. "Leave me alone." This time there was no immediate reply. The silence stretched, thick and oppressive. Minutes passed. Then, "I'm already inside." A rush of terror shot through her. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she stared at the words, her mind screaming at her to move. Slowly she turned her head. The apartment was quiet. Nothing seemed out of place. But the air felt wrong. Her throat tightened. She clutched her phone in a white-knuckled grip as she rose from the couch, stepping carefully onto the hardwood floor. Every sound seemed amplified. The creak of the wood beneath her feet, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint whistle of the wind outside. Her eyes flicked to the front door. Still locked. The windows? Sealed shut. Her breath quickened. Then how? A floorboard creaked behind her. She spun around, heart slamming into her ribs. The hallway leading to her bedroom stretched before her, dark and yawning. Her mind raced. Had that sound come from inside the apartment? Or had it been above her? Her stomach dropped. Slowly, eyes wide, she tilted her head back. A single muffled sound drifted from the ceiling. A soft scuffling, as if something heavy was shifting just above her. Her breath caught in her throat. There was no attic in her apartment, just the ceiling. And yet, tap, 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 the faintest rhythm of movement. Something was up there. Her fingers flew to her phone. She dialed Detective Harris's number with shaking hands. It rang, once, twice, then a thud directly above her. A hard, deliberate thud, like something had just dropped onto the ceiling. Olivia let out a strangled gasp, stumbling backward. Harris's voice came through the line. "Olivia?" Her voice broke. "Someone's in my apartment." "What? Where?" "The ceiling," she whispered. I don't have an attic, but I hear footsteps. A sharp intake of breath on the other end. Get out of there. Right now." She didn't need to be told twice. Her feet moved before she could think, rushing toward the front door. She fumbled with the lock, hands slick with sweat. A loud crash erupted from the ceiling. She let out a scream. Something heavy hit the floor in her bedroom. The hair on her arm stood on end. She yanked the door open and ran. The cold night air slapped her in the face as she stumbled onto the sidewalk, barely aware of her surroundings. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She heard tires screeching in the distance. A police cruiser rounded the corner, red and blue lights flashing. Harris was out of the car before it even fully stopped, his gun drawn. "Stay here," he ordered before disappearing into the building. Olivia clutched her arms, shaking violently as she watched more officers arrive, weapons ready. Minutes dragged by. Then Harris emerged. His expression was grim. "No sign of forced entry," he said. "No sign of anyone in your apartment." Olivia shook her head frantically. "I heard it. I heard him." Harris studied her for a long moment. "We'll check the security footage." Her hands clenched into fists. "He was in there. I'm not crazy." Harris sighed. "I believe you." His voice was softer now. "But until we find evidence, I need you to stay somewhere else, at least for tonight." Olivia hesitated. She didn't want to leave, didn't want to let the masked man drive her out. But when she looked up at the window of her apartment, she swore that for just a fraction of a second, she saw a shadow move, watching, waiting. She turned away, heart pounding. This wasn't over, not even close. Olivia sat in the dimly lit guest room of a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. The scent of stale cigarette smoke lingered in the air, despite the no smoking sign on the wall. The bed was stiff, the blankets rough against her skin, but none of that mattered. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, the man in the mask standing beneath the streetlight, his hollow black eyes locked on hers. Or worse, she imagined him inside her apartment, lurking in the dark corners, watching her while she slept. Her phone sat on the nightstand. Detective Harris's number pulled up, ready to call at the first sign of danger. But the real question was, what if he didn't come back? What if he was already here? A slow, shuddering breath left her lips. She had to go back. She had to find out how he was getting inside. No more running. By morning, she made her decision. Harris wouldn't approve, but she wasn't waiting around for another night in a sketchy motel. She drove home just as the sun rose over the city, the streets eerily empty. As she pulled into her apartment complex, a strange sense of calm settled over her. She needed answers. Climbing the stairs, she reached her door and hesitated. The police had secured it last night, but the memory of the noises, the footsteps above her, still sent chills down her spine. Key in hand, she unlocked the door and stepped inside. Silence. Everything was exactly as she had left it. The curtains drawn, the lights off, the untouched dishes in the sink. And yet, something felt off. She locked the door behind her and stepped forward carefully, scanning the room. Think, Olivia. If he wasn't breaking in through the door or the windows, where was he coming from? Her gaze flicked to the ceiling. No attic, no crawl space. Her fingers clenched. Then where? A memory resurfaced. The text. I'm already inside. A cold shiver ran through her. Her apartment was small, too small for someone to hide, but something nagged at her, a lingering sense of unease. And then her eyes landed on something she hadn't noticed before. A single thin line running along the edge of the floor. She crouched, heart hammering. The wooden floorboards near the hallway were uneven. Swallowing hard, she pressed her fingers against the seams, and then, click. The floor shifted. A tiny, almost imperceptible gap appeared between the boards. Her stomach lurched. Hands shaking, she wedged her fingers between the boards and pulled. The wood lifted with an unnatural ease, and beneath it, a dark, gaping hole. A hidden crawl space. Her breath caught. The space was just large enough for a person to fit. Dust clung to the edges, disturbed recently, as if someone had been crawling in and out. Her vision swam. He'd been inside all along. She barely had time to process the horror of it before something moved beneath her. A whisper of movement, a shift in the darkness. Then, hand shot up from the hole. A masked face lunged out of the floor. Olivia screamed. She scrambled backward as the figure crawled out, his body unfolding in unnatural jerks. The white porcelain mask caught the dim light, its painted smile stretching into something wrong. She turned and ran. Her feet pounded against the floor as she bolted toward the door. Her hands fumbled with the lock, breath coming in short gasps. A hand clamped around her ankle. She was yanked backward. She hit the floor hard, her head slamming against the wood. Stars exploded in her vision. A weight pressed down on her. The mask hovered inches from her face. The black, hollow eyes stared into hers. A deep, slow breath. Then, the man whispered, "I told you I was already inside." Pure, primal terror surged through Olivia. She lashed out, her knee slamming into his ribs. He grunted, the force knocking him off balance. She crawled forward, fingers grasping for anything, and found her lamp. Without thinking, she swung it. Crack! The masked man collapsed. She scrambled to her feet, chest heaving. He lay motionless, the mask slightly askew, just enough to reveal a glimpse of pale, scarred skin beneath. But she didn't stop to look. She grabbed her phone, hit speed dial. 911, what's your emergency? Olivia's voice trembled. He was inside, under my floor. The operator's voice was urgent. Stay where you are. Help is on the way. She pressed herself against the wall, heart hammering. The masked man twitched. A guttural laugh spilled from beneath the mask. Low, amused, as if he knew something she didn't. She gripped the lamp tighter, ready to swing again if she had to. The sirens blared outside. Heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs. The door burst open, Detective Harris leading the charge, gun drawn, his eyes locked on the masked figure. Don't move. The man stilled. 2 officers tackled him to the ground, pinning his arms behind his back. The mask shifted, revealing more of his face, a gaunt, twisted grin beneath scarred skin. Olivia's breath came in ragged gasps. Harris knelt beside her. Are you hurt? She shook her head, unable to form words. He turned toward the crawl space, his face darkened. Jesus Christ. They pulled the rest of the floorboards up. What they found chilled Olivia to the bone. A network of tunnels leading into the walls. Old tattered blankets. Scraps of food. Empty water bottles. He had been living there, watching her, waiting. Harris turned back to her, expression grim. He's been inside for a long time. A shudder racked her body. She stared at the masked man as the officers hauled him to his feet. He turned his head toward her, and despite being handcuffed, despite being caught, he smiled. A slow, deliberate grin that stretched beneath his ruined skin. Then he spoke, softly, lovingly. See you soon, Olivia. A scream threatened to rise in her throat, but she wouldn't give him that satisfaction. She forced herself to breathe, to watch as they dragged him away, to remind herself that it was over, even if, deep down, she wasn't sure it ever really would be. 2 weeks later, Olivia moved out of the apartment. The police investigation confirmed her worst fears. The masked man had been inside for months. He had slipped in through the building's old maintenance tunnels, carving out a hiding place beneath the floors. She never learned his name, didn't want to. All she knew was that he had been watching her, studying her, waiting for the right moment. And even now, in her new apartment, miles away, she still felt his presence. Every time she looked in the mirror, every time she walked down a dark street, every time she received a text from an unknown number. Don't forget me. She turned off her phone, but she knew, deep down, he would never forget her, and maybe, just maybe, he was already inside.
As this story ends, remember, out here in the wild, the terrors never truly vanish. They're always watching, waiting. If you dare to face them again, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You never know when the next nightmare will find you. Until then, stay safe or stay scared.